Hello EDUSPLORERs, thanks for joining us again and welcome back to another exciting and informative video on our YouTube channel. If you are joining us for the first time, we want to thank you for watching. In this episode, I will be looking at the reason why France's days as a military power in Africa are numbered. In this episode, I will be looking also more importantly why France's Niger debacle marks an end of an era in the continent of Africa. I will dive into specifics here, look at geopolitics, bring you analytical information, and let you know as the reason why the anti-French colonial policy in the continent of Africa is waning. So I will encourage you to watch this video to the end for clarity and better understanding. So without any more delay, let's just dive straight into it. French President Emmanuel Macron's decision to withdraw from Niger signaled the end of an era for France, one marked by military interventions in West African Sahel region, and a sense in Paris that its former colonies in Africa were still in some ways France's private preserves. Moving ahead, for more than 2 months, Macron took a defiant stand, ignoring the ultimatum set by the junta in Niger, who came to power in July after a military coup. France refused to engage with the junta leader or moved on their demand to remove France's troops stationed in the country fighting terrorism at the time. But in face-off between France and the putschist, Paris blinked first. Recently, Emmanuel Macron announced that France will gradually withdraw its 1,500 soldiers by the end of the year, and that France's ambassador, who had been living under quasi-house arrest in the capital Niamey in Niger, will be brought home. The ambassador, Sylvain Ait, returned home recently with 6 of his other colleagues. The repercussion of this decision, which came in the wake of forced withdrawal from the neighboring countries of Burkina Faso, Mali, and being felt far and wide, it is the latest blow in the series of setbacks for Paris in the region, where France's influence has once significantly replaced in some areas in the case of Russia, in a context where former colonies are seeking to diversify their partnership. The key question here every expert should be asking now are where the soldiers stationed in Niger will go, what Paris will do with the military bases it still has left on the continent of Africa, and how it will continue the fight against Islamist terrorism in the region. The ouster from Niger has triggered calls among observers and even within French diplomatic circles for France to truly overhaul how it engages with the African nations, including by reducing its military footprint on the continent of Africa as a whole. France tried to break the deadlock in Niger without recognizing the de facto authorities, and it's a climate of growing hostility. After 5 weeks of tension with the members of the July 26 coup, Paris has finally begun talks, at the time redeploying some of its forces in Niger, after initially refusing to comply with the demands of the Nigerian military, who have made political capital of the departure of France's soldiers. The Ministry of Armed Forces and several corroborating sources told other international media, specifically Le Monde, recently that they were discussing in details in the withdrawal certain military elements in that country. At the beginning of August, the junta gave France 1 month to withdraw from Nigerian territory after renouncing the military cooperation agreement between Paris and Niamey. On September 2nd, the eve of the expiration of the ultimatum set by the purchased in that country, thousands of pro-junta Nigerians once again demonstrate against the presence of the French military just a stone throw from the base that occupy Niamey with other foreign detachment. If you look at the tension between these two countries, in practice, the French and Nigerian military had already suspended all forms of joint operation against the jihadist group since the coup. All military sources, particularly air assets, drones, helicopters, fighter jets, and so on, were immobilized.
This has lasted for almost 2 months now, since the July coup, where the Niger's junta was calling for the French ambassador Sylvain Ité to leave Niger. And Macron was adamant that his ambassador would not leave. At one point, the junta gave the ambassador 48 hours to leave. This deadline passed and he was declared persona non grata. But Macron always was firm publicly in saying that the ambassador would stay on in Niamey. In fact, just last month, when Macron addressed his ambassadors, this is an annual meeting of French ambassadors in Paris, the focus of the meeting was actually on the ambassador who was not in the room. Ambassador Ite joined the meeting on a video link from Niamey. And at this meeting, Macron did not mince his word. Let's take a listen to what he said.
I think our policy is the right one. It's based on the courage of President Mohamed Bazoum and on the commitment of our diplomats and our ambassador on the ground, who remain steadfast despite the pressure.
But, you know, despite the talk behind the scenes, there was negotiations going on. And France 24 did an exclusive just 2 weeks ago where we had our sources telling us that the French officials were engaged in talks with some Niger military officials on a drawing down, a streamlining of drones and aerial reconnaissance missions. Because frankly, France's position was getting untenable, this position. You had an ambassador isolated in the embassy. Anti-French sentiment was rising. There were pro-coup demonstrations in Niamey. And France was not really getting the support of its allies. France was calling for a return of ousted leader President Mohamed Bazoum. This was echoed by its allies, but France was not getting the sort of support it needed. And so this situation was untenable, really.
The deep trend confirmed itself. Our military presence is no longer accepted. We need to totally rethink our relationship to the continent of Africa, according to one French expert, a former diplomat who, like other officials, quote, in other areas and publications, will want to stay and grant anonymity based on their discussion on those sensitive topics with regards to France's presence in the continent of Africa. He went ahead to say, we have been kicked out of Africa. We need to depart from other countries before we got told to go, the former diplomat has added, based on our own research. If you look at walking the talk, at Paris does not walk the talk so far. Most recently, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, promised that France will commit to a new type of military relationship with African nations, one that will be tainted with no neo-colonialist undertone, but rather be a partnership of equals, aiming for a reset in the region. Macron announced a fundamental overhaul of France's African strategy, where it will fight terrorism alongside local government, based on his own confirmation. There are about over 6,000 French soldiers reportedly still deployed on the continent of Africa, including in Senegal, Chad, Ivory Coast and Gabon. In the Sahel region, Paris has repeatedly explained that France armed forces were present at the request of governments seeking to contain a jihadist insurgents in the region. However, the ease with which military juntas in Mali, Burkina Faso and also in Niger have fueled and inflamed anti-French sentiment shows there is a different perception amongst local population. According to Pierre Horach, a lecturer in international relations and international security at the Queen's Mary University of London, based on our own research, the expert went ahead to say the French presence has become very counterproductive. France, with all its goodwill in the world, can't do much with the population and armies against them. He said, if France is to retain a presence, it must be invisible as possible, probably through the European Union. Based on his own analysis, he went ahead to say it is the end of a model in which France is seen as Africa's policeman, according to that expert. Despite Macron's stated reset of relationship with African nations, some officials argued that France's armed forces and networks of diplomats have been slow to change their ways. According to them, we need to pull out military bases, but there are internal issues. How to make its withdrawals be more acceptable? Also looking at the different aspects that we are engaged within the continent. It means we will no longer have have in fighting army, said a former French official.
So why then was France not getting that support from its Western allies and also allies within ECOWAS?
Well, that's an interesting question. Look, on the face of it, France's African and Western allies, European allies, were echoing France's statement of a return to democratic order. Now, ECOWAS, the West African bloc, initially said that they would have a military intervention, a rapid reaction force, but this did not happen. For starters, there were two countries, two member nations in ECOWAS, Burkina Faso and Mali, that themselves had military coups, and they declared that any intervention would be seen as an act of war. Now, the EU came out very strongly for a return to democratic order, but there was not consistency among EU member states. Italy and Germany, for instance, were calling for negotiations, for, toning down the rhetoric. And very important was the US position, because both France and the US have bases in Niger, considerable military assets in this country. If we look at a map, the US's biggest drone base in Africa is based in Agadir in Niger. Now, the US sent an envoy immediately after the coup to negotiate with the junta. It refrained from calling it a military coup, because under US legislation, if there is a military coup, Washington has to cut ties and pull out its troops. Why was the US calling for negotiations? Well, strategic interests and money, frankly. The US has put in a lot of money into its operations in Niger. From Niger, it surveys operations right from Somalia into Central Africa. So there was a lot of assets over there. And also, I think Washington was also thinking about the geostrategic calculations and security, because Niger is really important for security.
Indeed, unlike France's soldiers stationed on Europe's eastern flank, whose main missions are surveillance and training troops in the Sahel are engaged in combat operations. Looking ahead, it is a clear challenge for the country of France, as its global influence has been challenged in several ways, especially in the continent of Africa. For the French political elite, the Sahel debacle strikes a sensitive cohort and also charred, feeding fears that France might be losing its status as a global power. Based on analyst report, the debate has been so acute that Macron promised opposition parties there will be a public debate with lawmakers on France's policy in the Sahel, which could take place as early as November of this year. There is still feelings on the French side that the military presence in the Sahel region was one of the last symbols of France's hard power, and is in particular of the country's self-perception as a great world power, said Genobu Cisse, a researcher for the Paris-based Foundation for Strategic Research. Paris will need to come to terms, at least in the short term, that it will have less control over what's happening in the Sahel region, including when it comes to fighting terrorism and also re-engaging with African governments throughout the continent in a new, less militarized way. Based on analyst report, redeploying France's forces from Niger to Chad or even Ivory Coast will amount to kicking the can down the road, the researcher pointed out. For France, it is about mourning and giving up a part of its history to enter a new chapter. Based on analyst report, France's challenges in the region are not going to end anytime soon. If you consider France's perception of Africa based on their colonial mindset in terms of their operations and interaction, that is the reason why you see the high anti-French sentiment in West Africa, especially in the Francophone countries in the continent of Africa. France's presence had not proved successful. Looking at colonial history, its development, economic aspiration, growth, investment is lacking, is below par as compared to countries like China that have been engaging African infrastructures in several ways. France's reset is not going to work anytime soon until France accepts that we are no longer in the 1970s or in the 1940s. Hopefully we've informed you in regards to France's challenges in the region and why France has accepted its failure well with regards to its presence in the region, and more importantly, why France's days as a military power in the continent of Africa are numbered. Hopefully we've informed you. If you are new to our channel, we encourage you to check some of our informative video on this YouTube channel. We are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye bye.